to the What Really Happened radio show. The history the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show. It's Friday, March 8th, 2013, end of the week. Thank goodness it's Friday. Thank goodness it's Friday. And going into the weekend, we have got a lot of stuff to talk about today. And the phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. That's 800-313-9443. Either Sam or the lovely Miss Crystal, I'm not sure which one is sitting at the controls right now, but they'll be answering the phones as soon as you call on in to discuss what's going on. A reminder for all of our listeners, this weekend is the changeover to daylight savings time. Now, obviously, this does not apply if you live here in Hawaii or in Arizona, but on Saturday night when you go to bed, you need to set your clocks 1 hour forehead. You know, spring ahead and fall behind. And our show will still be at the normal time in the new daylight savings time, which means I actually do it an hour earlier in the day out here in Hawaii because we don't do daylight savings time. We're too close to the equator for it to really have any kind of a significant difference here. Now, over this weekend, a couple of astronomy things I'm going to start out with. They're reporting on this asteroid the size of a city block is going to fly by the Earth this weekend, coming within about 600,000 miles. It's more than twice the distance to the moon, so it doesn't even really qualify as a near miss. And, of course, Comet Pan-STAR is now becoming visible to the northern hemisphere. They're expecting it to be at its brightest and most presentable on Tuesday, but will be in the northern sky for pretty much the rest of the month. Naked eye object binoculars will help. There are actually two comets in the sky right now, Pan-STAR and then this other smaller one that takes a telescope to see, and there's the big one, ISON, that's due in November that they're saying could be one of the brightest comets in history. Is it me, or does it seem like there's a whole lot more stuff whizzing by the planet these days? All these comets and asteroids and the rest of it. And I ask that because there is a theory in astronomy. This first part isn't a theory. It's known that our sun, in addition to traveling around the Milky Way galaxy, it also bobs up and down. And when it goes through the densest part of the spiral arm in which we're located, the close approach of other stars will disturb what's called the Oort cloud and send a lot of debris in toward the center of the solar system. And it takes about 1 million years, they calculate, for this debris to start coming on in and crashing into things. And coincidentally, about 1 million years ago is the last time we bobbed through that center. So we may be actually seeing the beginning of a greater density of comets and asteroids and other debris coming in from outside of the orbit of Neptune. Or Pluto, for those who still insist Pluto's a planet, because that's what we grew up with. Anyway, getting into the economic news, of course, the corporate media is crowing strongly about the February unemployment report. 236,000 jobs were created, not really saying how many were lost, and most of those jobs apparently are tied in with health care, because hospitals and insurance companies and everybody are having to hire up new staffers to go through that maze of Obamacare paperwork that is all of a sudden starting to pour on to everybody. And they're waving around the fact 7.7 unemployment rate. Huzzah, huzzah, huzzah. Now, we know that number is kind of bogus, and even CNN admitted that the lowered jobless rate was mostly caused by over 100,000 people permanently dropping out of the job market because they've been looking for jobs for 1, 2, 3 years and can't find anything. And we know that not too long ago, CNN reported that there are 86 million invisible unemployed. So the real jobless rate is up about 40%. We're going to talk about this a little bit more when we come back from these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. So we're talking about the February jobs report and how supposedly 250,000 jobs were added to the economy, many of which created by Obamacare and the need to hire more people to pass pieces of paper around, put signatures on them, rubber stamps, and all the rest of it. It's very non-productive work. They're not actually making anything that can be sold. It's just drowning in the sea of gratuitous mandatory paperwork. And Obama sees this as job creation, but they're not productive jobs, and that's an important factor to keep in mind. So the report came out just ahead of the stock market open, and everybody was predicting a huge surge to new record highs, and there was a surge at the open, huge amount of volume, but it didn't really stick, and almost immediately it started back down, and now it's sort of like fighting between the sell-offs and the plunge protection team and the high-frequency traders. Because remember, these banks that have bought so much stock to keep the market up, and they have that stock on their balance sheet, now they're trapped. They have to do everything they can to keep that stock number up, or they're instantly insolvent. Lie, cheat, steal, bribe, whatever. Usual stuff that we see the bankers doing. But it may be that sudden sell-off could have been some profit taking from the peak, or it may just be that more and more investors are aware of that issue of the 86 million invisible unemployed, and that this 7.7% that they're waving around the corporate media right now really it's a joke. It's 7.7% unemployed among the people who are still getting unemployment benefits and going to their state employment offices to register for work. For people who have run out of benefits, for people who are have simply quit looking for work, and they're going back to a one-income household, for people who are trying to find work outside the systems that are being tracked, they're just simply not seen and they're not counted. And that's how they rig the numbers. But you need to understand, the Dow is being waved around like a big banner about how great everything is, but you need to keep the overview. U.S. personal income has fallen $505 billion. And what's really kind of strange if you think about it, Wall Street keeps recommending the same failed policies: cut labor costs, austerity, and 2/3 of our economy rests on consumer spending. And when you impoverish the consumers, you're pulling the rug out of your own financial system. And nobody inside Wall Street seems to want to look at that. Or they're all completely caught up in Adam Smith and saying, well, I'm doing really well and it doesn't matter what's happening to anybody else. But the economy is an integrated, intertwined whole, and if you're not taking care of the whole economy at all levels and all sectors, you're heading into trouble. This is a classic bubble. I'm smelling tulips in the air on this one here. Alrighty, so moving right along. The March job report is not likely to be quite as nice as the February one because of the mandated austerity cuts. Apparently 60,000 border and customs agents are going to be taking 2-week furloughs every month starting next month because of the cross-government spending cuts. And that means the flow of products across our borders will be slowed down and impeded. And obviously, the borders are more wide open than they were before. So if somebody wanted to walk a nuclear weapon into the United States from Mexico, it's going to be even easier than it was before. Despite all the budget cut screaming and crying and everything, the United States Air Force seems to have the money to acquire new extended-range drones for overseas operations. And apparently the U.S. is trying to advance the drone program, and they're already talking about pushing it into the 2014 budget as a way of sort of reducing its impact in 2013. They're going to issue the contracts now and pay for them next year. Mexico has now informed the Bank of England they want to physically audit their gold stored at the Bank of England. And it turns out this is the first time Mexico is asking for this to be done. Up until now, it's all based on trust. But more and more countries are starting to get very, very nervous over the way the New York Federal Reserve, Bank of France, Bank of England have been responding to these requests for physical audits, or at least just a visual inspection. When this whole issue started in Germany wanted to go to the Bank of England and check out the gold they had there. And the Bank of England said, well, we're really not set up to allow guests into the vaults. These aren't guests. These are the people who own that gold bullion on deposit in your bank. Now, Ron Paul is out there expressing serious concerns about a currency war, which, whether officially declared or not, does seem to be underway right now. There's currency devaluations going all over. We're hearing people in the United States government saying, well, if we devalue the currency, it's going to improve our export market. If we price this GMO corn low enough, people will buy it even if it's bad for them. And what they don't seem to understand is if you devalue the dollar in a nation heavily dependent on imported products, the price of those imported products is going to go right through the roof. So it may be good for corporations that are trying to export, but it's going to be bad for ordinary American people, and Ron Paul's correctly pointing this out. Now, apparently, John Kerry is out promoting something called the NATO economy. In other words, they want to take all of the nations in NATO and put them under a single unified economic system. Underneath, obviously, a privately owned central bank. They want to do with NATO the same thing that Europe did with the European Union, and we can all see how wonderfully well that worked out over there. So the big push is now on that we're going to solve all the world's economic problems with a global reserve banking system, which will condemn the human race to permanent debt, slavery, in perpetuity. And Kerry's out there pushing that whole agenda again. Now, over at Blacklisted News, interesting article. Elizabeth Warren is making a big stink about it. How many billions of drug-laundered money does it take to shut down a bank? Because we're seeing time and time again all of these banks that are caught laundering drug money. And Elizabeth Warren puts it quite correctly. If you're caught with an ounce of cocaine, the chances are good you're going to go to jail for the rest of your life. But if you launder $1 billion for the cocaine smugglers, your company pays a fine, and you get to go home and sleep in your own bed at night. And Ms. Warren is absolutely correct. Bankers should not be above the law. And yet we are seeing from Eric Holder this clear, hands-off attitude. Now, there may be two different explanations for it. In the first, Holder may really believe that charging and prosecuting bank fraud will crash the U.S. economy. Frankly, I don't think it's really going to make a difference. It has to crash sometime. And letting bankers get away with enriching themselves through more fraud against the people of the United States of America isn't going to make the eventual crash any easier or better. It just makes those bankers richer. The other issue is, and this may tie in very much with Ms. Warren's concerns about how all these banks are caught laundering drug money for the cartels. Because don't forget, Eric Holder is also tied in with this whole Fast and Furious gun running scandal, where they were supposedly sending guns into Mexico to track them and find out where the bad guys were. And the guns vanished and wound up in the hands of a favored drug cartel, apparently, and they're coming across the border from Mexico, especially with those 60,000 Customs and Border agents on furlough now. So it may well be that these money center banks in Wall Street sent a private message to Eric Holder. You will not touch us, or we will tell the world what was really going on with Fast and Furious. Now, my theory is Fast and Furious was a repeat of the Whitewater Iran-Contra gun and drug running operation that was operating out of Clinton's Arkansas when he was governor, flying clandestine-made assault weapons, war weapons, down to Nicaragua to support the Contras, and funding it all with cocaine being flown back in, with the money laundered through that loose connection of savings and loans and land flips, Whitewater, Flowerwood, Castle Grand, Morgan Guarantee and Trust, and the money basically sent out through a government financing organization called the Arkansas Development Finance Authority. The checks went out supposedly as loans to all of the businesses that were involved in this gun running operation. Loans, of course, that were never repaid. They simply zeroed the books out at the end of every month. That was the money machine. Now, back during the Great Depression, there was almost a caricature of stockbrokers jumping out of buildings because they lost everything. We don't see that in New York anymore because it's all air conditioned. Nobody has a window that will open, which has probably kept a lot of those Wall Street people alive. But apparently, we're starting to see this happen across Europe. Ruined businessmen leaping out of buildings and committing suicide. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And the lovely Miss Crystal is in our control room, so you can call on in and talk to her and get on the air. And a reminder, I forgot to mention at the top of the show, the lovely Lady Claire will be joining us in hour number 3 to share her perspective on what's been going on this last week. Alrighty, so over in France, there's a bit of a kerfuffle involving a Goodyear tire factory that's over there. They're in the middle of contract negotiations with the union, and the owners of the factories are basically taking the attitude that they just as soon shut that factory down because French workers are lazy, overpaid, and talk too much. Well, I don't think they're very lazy because following that insult, they're now rioting in the streets. And again, you need to understand something about the way the economy works. If you're selling a consumer product, you've got to make sure the consumers are able to buy it. Now, Henry Ford, who had a lot of really good ideas, he made a point of paying his workers. When he started his car company, he paid them enough of a salary where they themselves could afford to buy the cars they were building. And they became his best advertising, because up until that point, cars were something only the very rich could afford. And Henry Ford was building his car for ordinary Americans, working Americans to own. And he paid his own workers enough where they could buy those cars, drive them around. People saw working guys. And the sales took off. And Henry Ford had a philosophy which seems to have vanished from modern America, that the best way to become prosperous is to make the community around you prosper. These days, it all seems to be all for me, and we don't care if you're starving in the streets. But when you are cutting the wages and salaries to the people who work for you, you're cutting their purchasing power. Your employees, collectively on the national level, your employees are also your customers. And one of the worst mistakes that we have seen Wall Street do in their Adam Smith, I'm only thinking about myself frenzy, was the immediate profits from consumer debt were so attractive. Everybody piled onto that whole consumer debt, and they starved other sectors of the economy, like job creation, business development. They starved those for investment capital. And that means at the same time they were trying to get more and more Americans deeper and deeper into debt, they were taking away the ability of Americans to pay that consumer debt. And so if Wall Street is hovering on the verge of collapse, they did it to themselves. They're trying to blame you, like this tycoon there with the tire factory. Oh, you're just lazy. You're not working hard enough. You took the high-paying jobs away. They were lured to other countries by tax incentives, not only by the foreign government, but by our own. In a healthy economy, labor precedes capital. Real wealth begins with people who make things or grow things to sell. When you turn your back on that segment of the population, the system starts to dissolve from the bottom, and the cracks are now starting to reach up into the highest levels of the economy. That's why the Federal Reserve is having to run those printing presses 24 hours a day, trying to hold it together. When it all comes crashing down, the fingers will be pointing, but Wall Street did this to themselves. With this attitude of, if I am personally greedy, somehow the system will improve as a whole. Obviously not. Nobel Prize-winning mathematician John Nash proved in his doctoral dissertation why this was not going to work. But nobody wanted to look at it because Adam Smith justified personal greed and aggrandizement. He played to the baser instincts of these sociopaths who seek these positions of wealth and power. They didn't want a cautionary tale from John Nash that said, if you're not maintaining an overview, you will bring down this system, which is exactly what's happening. Now, over in Greece, apparently as part of a condition for this latest bailout, Greece has agreed to give up all of its gold bullion in exchange for the latest bailout, which means now Greece is hopelessly trapped by the central bank. Because if Greece ever wanted to do what they should have done in May 2010 and default on the banksters and go back to the drachma, now they can't. As far as international trade is concerned, they have nothing to back the drachma up with. Now, as far as the private bankers are concerned, Greece, with its 111 tons of gold, is a practice run. They're going to do the same thing to every other country. Portugal has 382 tons of gold. France has 2,400 tons of gold. Italy, same amount. They want to grab the gold to make it impossible for these European nations to break away and go back to their own currency. This may be another reason why the Bank of France and the New York Federal Reserve are giving Germany the stall, so Germany can't go back to a gold-backed Deutschmark. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Little factoid you may want to be thinking about in the very near future. If you are an American, your portion of the officially acknowledged national debt is now above $53,000. That's for every single American. Little tiny, just born babies, 80, 90-year-old people just hanging around those nursing homes. Everybody, $53,000 for the officially acknowledged federal government debt. And we know that the official U.S. government debt is as phony as the jobless numbers because it does not include unfunded mandates, and it doesn't include all of this money that has been used to try and bail out Wall Street going back to 2008. Because remember, the Federal Reserve can't just crank out that $85 billion in new money every month without a corresponding Treasury bond from the Treasury Department. It is still technically a loan to the American people through the government, which is then handed to the banks. And they're not admitting how much that is. They're still trying to keep a lot of that secret. Federal Reserve's trying to hide that because it's an absolutely obscene number. Now we're seeing all of these countries in Europe as austerity kicks in and the economy collapses from the bottom because, again, without a consumer economy, you can't run an entire nation just on the bankers shoveling the money back and forth to each other. And there have been riots. They're rioting in France right now. They ought to be rioting in Greece over this gold bullion deal. And we're seeing this article that came over, actually it was a YouTube video, saying that the American riots will be the worst in the world because 80% of Americans have guns, despite this intense propaganda campaign to convince us all that guns are icky poo. And you need to add one other factor to that nobody's talking about. 10% of the American people are on prescription antidepressants. A sudden collapse of the financial system, delivery systems. I mean, remember, pharmaceutical companies have already stopped sending medicine to Greece because they don't know they're going to get paid for it. So a sudden collapse of the U.S. system is going to result in 10% of the American population being forced onto absolute cold turkey withdrawal from these prescription antidepressants, some of which can take as long as a year to taper down slowly. And that is going to accelerate and exacerbate the violence. We're going to see people running around, baseball bats, whipping on each other, whipping on the government. That's another factor that people are not looking at, is our government buys all these armored tanks for the police and machine guns and microwave pain rays and all the rest of this stuff that they're going to use to try and cling to power. And that's really what it's all about. That's what all these preparations are about. They're not really worried about you, the American people, kicking down their doors and stringing them up on piano wire. Because as far as I'm concerned, I'd be perfectly happy for all these money junkies and the politicians to simply leave the country. Take your ill-gotten gains and go. Good riddance, and we focus on rebuilding a new country. But the government and the money junkies don't want to do that. They're going to try and hang on to power no matter how much the American people want them to leave. And that's the real reason for all of this buying hollow point bullets for all these non-law enforcement agencies of the government, like the National Weather Service. Nobody's seriously thinking of kicking down the doors of the National Weather Service and complaining over the fact that they blew a forecast and my sporting event was ruined or some such. And by the way, we've all seen government workers and how poorly they perform their government jobs and their complete lack of enthusiasm. Do you really think these people are going to man the barricades and risk their lives to protect their bosses against an enraged American people? I really don't see that happening. But what we're going to do is, I really am convinced we're going to see this system collapse pretty much the way the Soviet Union did. And the hardliners in the Soviet Union tried to cling to power by literally arming themselves and barricading themselves inside one of their main government buildings, which they call the White House. Not the same thing as our White House in Washington, D.C., but there's a Russian White House. And they barricaded themselves, and they said, we're going to kill anybody who tries to take us out of power. And that's what we're going to see here in this country. And we'll just wait them out. Even with all these guns and bullets, they can't reconquer the nation. They're planning a defensive campaign against us going in and saying you're fired, 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 fired. I'd like to avoid violent riots. I'd like to avoid a bloody revolution. I'm trying to figure out a way to get from here to the next nation with a minimum of bloodshed. But how bloody and violent this is going to be is up to the federal government, and very clearly they are planning on making this as bloody as they need to hang on to power. I'm sure they're perfectly content to kill 20% of the American population if it makes the remaining 80% obedient slaves to the money junkies in perpetuity. It seems to be the agenda out there. Meanwhile, speaking of precious metals and Republic Trading Group, silver investment demand has surged 30%. We've even reported where even the U.S. Treasury had to stop issuing new investment silver coins because silver was in short supply. And a lot of people are starting to say that silver actually seems to be doing a little bit better than even gold because there's a much larger supply. The money center banks haven't been playing fast and loose with people's silver bullion, mostly the gold. The prices are still being kept down, of course, because the money junkies don't want you deserting the stock market. They don't want you pulling your money out of your savings account and getting silver and gold coins. They're going to do everything they can to keep you putting your hard-earned money into that stock market, including rigging it up to higher and higher levels. But that is a classic bubble. They can't keep it up indefinitely. Meanwhile, story out of the Los Angeles Times, apparently in one of only 2 known prosecutions of the robo-signers, a judge just threw out the entire case against 2 people living in Orange County who were engaged in this. Now, the robo-signing was this very widespread practice where these companies were set up to generate paperwork for banks and mortgage companies to carry out foreclosures if they had somehow lost or misplaced the original documents. It's a fraud. It's an outright fraud. They didn't have the real documents, so they faked them up. And people were signing these documents who were not legally authorized to sign these documents. There was a lot of fake notary stuff going on. Only 2 prosecutions for this foreclosure gate fraud across the nation, and now one of them has been thrown out of court. And it's just a reminder, bankers, financial people are indeed above the law. Remember Obama's foreclosure settlement? They literally went around to all 50 states and they arm-twisted the attorney generals to drop all criminal investigations of foreclosure fraud. And they said, we'll have a foreclosure settlement. The involved companies will have a wrist slap fine, and then they get to go home and sleep in their beds that night. And they talk about these very large sums of money involved in the settlement, but when you finally divided it down to the people whose homes were taken wrongfully, they're each getting, after legal fees, they're getting like $3,000 or $5,000 in exchange for their home. Now, over in Ohio, interesting little story. Last September, the town of Elmwood Place installed 2 traffic cameras to record vehicle speed and issue citations. And in the first month, these cameras issued 6,600 speeding citations. That's 3 times the number of people who actually live there, and generated an estimated $1.5 million in fines. We're at the era where local governments are literally pillaging their own people to survive. And you need to understand something about these traffic enforcement cameras. They are operated by private companies that will set them up, and they will split the fines with the city, the county. So they have a financial incentive to tweak these things to generate the maximum number of tickets they can. We had that out here in Hawaii, and it turned out that the cameras were so far adjusted so tight, they were issuing a lot of false tickets, and the system had to finally be taken down. Obviously, when you have 3 times as many speeding tickets as there are people living in the town in 1 month, something is obviously wrong here. And it's not about traffic enforcement. It's not about traffic safety. It's about finding another way to take more money from the people so the people in power can go on living their exalted high lifestyles. Now, you've probably been hearing about this story over there in New York, the so-called cannibal cop. And his case has now gone to the jury to see if he will be convicted for plotting to kidnap, kill, and eat some attractive young ladies. Now, the defense is saying it was simply a harmless fantasy role play, and the prosecutor is saying, no, it's no joke. He seemed to be doing the things necessary to actually carry out his plans. So I guess the new motto for the police is to protect and to serve, with some fava beans and a nice bottle of Chianti. And we're supposed to turn on our guns and trust these police officers to save us from the bad guys. These police officers are the bad guys in many cases. And again, the unasked question, was this guy on or withdrawing from prescription antidepressants? And we really do need to know. There's a lot of wacko behavior going on in our society. And I think we've poisoned our own brains with these medications. And that's why we're seeing all of this very aberrant behavior. Cannibal cop? I want to know what he was on in terms of medications. I think we all have a need to know. Remember the other day I was saying 10% of the American people are on these medications. We may presume that includes 10% of all the police officers. Now, the news is making a big deal that Osama bin Laden's son-in-law has been arrested and brought to New York for his trial for conspiracy to murder the American people. Now, originally he was billed as the spokesman for Osama bin Laden. Now they've given him a job promotion. They're calling him the consigliere, which means top advisor. And they're saying this gentleman is cooperating fully and he's revealing key intelligence. And I think the reason they're bringing this guy to New York instead of Gitmo is to make this a show trial, to publicly reinforce the official 9/11 myth. And the timing would suggest that the U.S. government is going to start waving terrorists at us to counter the rising opposition to the use of drone strikes both in and outside the United States of America. So this Osama bin Laden's son-in-law, by the way, has pled not guilty. So it's going to be a long, drawn-out, very public show trial. They've got something to wave at us so that we're not thinking about the economy and we're not thinking about the lies leading to war with Iran. And to increase the degree of fluffiness that we're getting from the corporate media, Bill Clinton has now gone public saying it is time to overturn the Defense of Marriage Act that he himself signed in 1996. And he's now saying the only reason he signed that, this was basically a bill to outlaw gay marriage, was because he was afraid that his opponents in Congress were going to try and put it through as a constitutional amendment. I don't think it would have succeeded in ratification. On the other hand, that's never stopped the Congress before. And now he's saying it's time to repeal it. So what they're doing is they're trying to fan up the debate about gay marriage. It's not even a campaign year. They're throwing distractions at us left and right. What is it they don't want us paying attention to? We're being conditized all over again. Now, down in Venezuela, they're still in the week of mourning over Hugo Chavez. And the leaders of the opposition, these were the people who were involved in that failed U.S. coup attempt a while back. And they're already out there criticizing all of Hugo Chavez's potential successors, saying they're not following the Constitution, they're not doing this, they're not doing that. I would almost wager that this opposition just had a sudden influx of cash from sources unknown. CIA. Because Venezuela is in play, and the prize is Venezuela's oil, more than Saudi Arabia has, Venezuela's gold mines, their uranium, and again, it's inevitable. It has to be part of this plan by the United States to dollarifize all of the world's resource-rich areas. Hugo Chavez was sharing the oil wealth with his ordinary people. He was selling the oil to China for the yuan. These are all threats to the Wall Street money junkies. Now, Maduro has been sworn in as the new interim president. There are going to be elections. He doesn't get to keep the job for very long, but he's been sworn in. They have a new president down there. Meanwhile, leaders from 30 countries, including Raul Castro and Ahmadinejad, are in Venezuela for the funeral. And the body is lying in state. More than 2 million people have viewed it since Wednesday. China has once again, speaking of Iran and Ahmadinejad, China has again reiterated support for Iran's nuclear rights, reminding everybody that Iran has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and has a right to nuclear power, medical isotopes, and peaceful industrial applications. The United States, of course, is in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty both by ignoring Article 4, which commits them to help Iran build peaceful uses of nuclear technology, and also by using the threat of military force to coerce Iran into surrendering its rights under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's the U.S. that is failing to live up to its international obligations, not Iran. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. The Pentagon is now deploying more Marines and Green Berets to Africa, to what they are calling the new African-based Marine Crisis Response Unit. And this is part of a broader effort to give Africa Command the ability to confront emerging terrorism. In other words, it's the beachhead for the conquest of Africa, which is the world's, world's largest undeveloped natural resources. And that's why Africa is in play. So the U.S. is garrisoning Africa with this Marine and Green Beret deployment Has nothing to do with terrorism and everything to do with forcing those African nations to sell their natural resources only for the U.S. dollar. That's what they're doing. That's the game plan here. Now, we're seeing a story, this came out of Blacklisted News, that evidence has surfaced that Blackwater, Mossad, and the Central Intelligence Agency were involved in the military violence in the Homs district. So these Syrian so-called rebels, the Free Syria Army, 95% of whom are not Syrian, are directly communicating with Mossad, Blackwater, and CIA in attempting to overthrow Assad. I can't imagine anybody outside the Beltway of Washington, D.C., who still buys this myth, this hallucination that this is a popular uprising. It doesn't act like a popular uprising. It doesn't have the numbers of a popular uprising. Remember when there was a genuine popular uprising in Egypt that ousted Mubarak? Did you see the U.S. sending in heavy weapons to the Egyptian people? No, the U.S. was sending tear gas to Mubarak. Now, further complicating things, and we know that North Korea has a history of blustering a lot. But North Korea has announced that it will end the ceasefire armistice with South Korea this coming Monday. North Korea and South Korea never technically ended their war. They just said, if you stop shooting, we'll stop shooting, and here's the line that we don't cross. And there's been a ceasefire in place all the way up until now that will end, per North Korea, on Monday. North Korea is also threatening to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against the United States in retaliation for the new UN sanctions that have been imposed upon it. Now, North Korea does not have a rocket able to loft one of their nuclear warheads over here, but they could smuggle one inside a cargo ship. They could walk one over the border from Mexico. Going to take a break for station identification. More about North Korea after these words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. So we're talking about this announcement from North Korea that they will officially end the ceasefire with South Korea as of Monday, and warning of a preemptive nuclear attack against the United States in response to these UN sanctions. Now, I don't think North Korea is really going to do it. They don't have a rocket with which to send over a nuclear bomb. They could smuggle one over in a cargo ship or across the border from Mexico, but they're not going to do it because they have maybe one or two bombs. They may have even gotten them from Israel. We know Israel was caught selling clandestine nuclear weapons. They tried to sell one to South Africa. And we know that the isotopic signature of Korea's first nuclear test matched the isotopic signature of a joint Israeli-South African test that took place in the South Atlantic many years ago. But North Korea, for all their bluster and bluff, they're not going to nuke the United States because the United States would nuke North Korea back overwhelmingly. Now, would somebody set off a nuke in the United States and blame North Korea for it? Sure, why not? It's worked before. But before the fingers get pointed in too many directions, I wish to point out it is the United States that provoked this crisis by maintaining a policy that only the U.S. and its allies, otherwise known as the good guys, were allowed to have nuclear weapons, then started to invade nation after nation after nation that did not have nuclear weapons. So North Korea, probably not wishing to be invaded, has developed a nuclear weapons program. So the U.S. pushes the UN to impose sanctions, a move guaranteed to escalate the situation. Because war with North Korea will mean war with China, and the ultimate goal here is to isolate China politically and economically to prevent the gold-backed yuan from replacing the dollar as the global trade and reserve currency. Plus, if the U.S. can gin up a war with China, they get to stiff China on all the debt that the U.S. owes them. We don't have to pay you back all those trillions and trillions of dollars. You're our enemy now. We get to keep the money. We'll just throw a few million of our kids over there to die. And that'll all pencil out, so many $1 million saved for so many children killed. And behind it all, of course, are the money junkies, the bankers, the private central bankers, just drooling over how much debt slavery they will create with a new world war. Going to go to the phones here. Peter in California. Aloha, Peter. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Michael. Just wanted to compare and contrast the Korean nuclear situation and our relations with Korea versus those of Iran and their situation. Korea has nukes. As a matter of fact, Michael, I was briefed by the head of the NATO and U.S. commander in 1995 that the North Koreans had one or two nukes even in 1995.
Okay.
That's right from his mouth to a briefing of about 1,000 majors and colonels.
Mm-hmm.
At any rate, but the difference, Mike, is that you can see is obviously they've got them. They can actually threaten a first strike. They can do all sorts of things, and we're dismissing it. As a matter of fact, Jay Carney, the White House spokesman, just came out and said, "Oh, they're really no big threat." That was his his quote today. That, "Don't worry about North Korea; they're no big threat." Well, they have nuclear weapons, and
so do a lot of people. So do a lot of people. We got to take a commercial break. I'm going to come back to this after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And we're talking with Peter in California about North Korea's renewed belligerence. They're going to basically end the ceasefire in the Korean War. And they're talking about a preemptive nuclear strike. But I find myself in agreement with the White House spokesman that this is not a credible threat, simply because it doesn't matter that North Korea has a nuclear weapon. They can't use it preemptively without committing national suicide, because the United States is, let me finish, the United States is still the largest nuclear power on Earth, and the United States is the only nation that has ever actually used a nuclear weapon against the civilians of another country. So the reality here is a lot of countries have nuclear weapons. Doesn't guarantee they are going to use them. So the mere fact that North Korea has a nuclear weapon, I don't feel threatened by North Korea, and I'm probably about as close to them as any American you're going to find right now. I'm much more worried about the United States using nuclear weapons than North Korea.
Well, Michael, you're absolutely right. I'm not concerned about it either. I mean, if they have them, they have very few and no delivery systems, and they get, absolutely wasted. However, I wanted to compare that, even though it's a crucial part of the world where, the armed forces of the United States, Japan, China, and Russia all are within a couple hundred miles of each other. But we're letting that go. But we are focusing on Iran with multiple carriers and so on and so forth, who has all 16 of our intelligence agencies are saying does not even made the decision to get a nuclear weapons program, and doesn't have it, has never threatened us. We've never been to war with them, have never threatened us with a first strike, nothing like that. And the difference is that A, there's no oil underneath North Korea, I believe, and B, Israel is not in the equation. And
well, no, that's a good point to make, and you're absolutely right. All of this talk about North Korea being a threat and all of these military war games that provoked the current situation didn't start happening until China was announcing to the world that they thought their gold-backed yuan ought to be the international trade currency in place of the dollar. And that's when we started seeing all this China bashing. When Russia took control of their central bank, now we're getting all this Russia bashing. It's all about controlling the world economy for the American money junkies, the European money junkies, basically all of these private central banks. And North Korea's nuclear weapons, you're absolutely right. They've had them for quite some time. But it's an issue now because the goal, and again, this has nothing to do with Korea, it's all about provoking a war with China to remove the threat of the gold-backed yuan from the dollar.
Amazing, though, the difference in the way we respond, though, isn't it, Michael? I mean,
Well, I mean, absolutely. You don't even have to go to North Korea to see that. I mean, nobody can find any evidence Iran is doing anything wrong, but they're bad, nuclear threat. Meanwhile, Israel has nuclear weapons. They haven't signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They refuse inspections. They've been caught selling clandestine nuclear weapons, the very activity the Non-Proliferation Treaty is supposed to prevent, and nobody says anything critical about them. Because Israel's nuclear weapons are good, and Iran's non-existent nuclear weapons are bad.
I'm absolutely in agreement with you. That's what I wanted to bring up. So thanks, Michael. Appreciate it.
All right, yeah, I misunderstood initially what you were saying about North Korea having nuclear weapons that far back. I would presume that because Israel was selling clandestine nuclear weapons, as was documented from documents from the previous South African government, that probably a lot more nations have these nuclear weapons than we are aware of. And they don't have nuclear weapons to carry out an attack on the United States because to do so would be suicidal. The reason to have a nuclear weapon is as a deterrent. Do not invade me or I will hurt you. And the object lesson coming out of Iraq, Afghanistan, all of these other countries the United States is invading right now. Look what happens if you don't have a nuclear weapon. That's the object lesson. Kyle in Pennsylvania. Aloha, Kyle. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. You may have covered it, but I'm not 100% sure. I don't know if you heard what the second-in-command in the USSR, Russia, said. He flat out said that the spirit of World War III is in the air, and I think that the chance for World War III has never been greater than it is today.
I would absolutely agree.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold thing for a worldwide power player to come out and say, and I can't agree with him, especially when you look at how the World War II played out.
Okay, we're getting a really bad phone connection, and I'm going to let you go here. But I think anybody who's paying attention to the situation, first of all, technically, under U.S. military doctrine, we are already in World War III. The United States has invaded 10 countries on 2 continents. It's a two-front war, and that is what constitutes a world war under U.S. military doctrine. So we're already in it. We're just waiting for the big bang where ordinary people who aren't paying attention will look up and say, oh, yes, we're in World War III now. And that bang may be nuclear, because all of these warmongering nations, the United States, Israel, all the rest of them, are dealing with the fact that their populations are already sick and tired of war. We have been in this current war phase longer than we were in World War II. Everybody's tired of it. They're tired of seeing their kids coming home in those cheap metal boxes. They're tired of all the lies and excuses why we have to go and commit more war someplace else. But from the United States point of view, this dollarification program has to succeed. They have to go all the way to the end or have your kids die trying, because it won't work if they only have half the nations forced onto the dollar, because the rest of the world will go to those nations that are not using the dollar to buy their natural resources. And so the U.S. is committed. They're in too deep. They can't turn around and say, we're sorry, let's go back to status quo ante. Here's your country back, and let's try and be friends again. It's not going to work. And so anybody who's paying attention very clearly, and I've been saying this for more than 2 years now, the end result of this program of all these countries being conquered and brought into the dollar's sphere of influence is going to be war with Russia and China. Russia has made that very clear. When the U.S. goes into Syria and Iran, Russia will turn them into the new Vietnam and wear this country down in a war of attrition. Russia can do it. The United States is already exhausted militarily, financially, spiritually. We're finding out now that all of our new high-tech wonder weapons aren't very wonderful at all. They're hideously overpriced and woefully ineffective. And that is why we are risking a nuclear world war, because the United States government, they've got all their bunkers. They're already set to go. Sometime between now and final capitulation of the United States government, they will start turning those keys on those missile silos, and it's going to be a bad day for anybody not wearing 2 million sunblock. And to the money junkies, this is an acceptable risk. If you go back and you look at that article I wrote, All Wars Are Banker Wars, the bankers will not hesitate to send hundreds of millions of people to horrible, painful deaths in order to make themselves richer. That is how sociopathic they truly are. They're willing to risk a nuclear war to maintain their financial control over the world's people. They've got their bunkers. They're the biggest preppers of all. You paid for all of it. You will not be allowed into it. Might as well deal with that. By the way, speaking of bunkers, a story that came out of BusinessInsider.com, where they're starting to ask, why is the United States spending hundreds of millions of dollars building these bunkers in Israel? When the first one was being built, and it was supposed to be a forward deployment site for U.S. weapons to use in the event of a Middle East conflict, and then after it was all built up and supplied and stocked and armed, the U.S. turned around and said that Israel had the option of using those weapons anytime they felt it was necessary. So, in effect, even though the U.S. was saying it's a U.S. secret arms cache, they were basically building an armory for Israel at U.S. taxpayer expense. And this is not counted in with the billions and billions in official aid that's going over there. And now apparently they've started to build another one. We have a federal government that is drowning in unpayable debt, homeless vets sleeping in our streets, women and children eating out of trash dumpsters, infrastructure's falling apart, and the U.S. government is spending your tax money building arms caches for Israel to project terror and aggression across the Middle East. What is wrong with this picture? Pretty much everything. Speaking of Israel, there was a peaceful protest in the West Bank in the aftermath of that Palestinian dissident being tortured to death and the continuing activities of the illegal settlers in uprooting and destroying the Palestinians' olive groves. And it was a peaceful protest until the IDF decided they didn't want international journalists taking so many embarrassing pictures. And they tear-gassed them, including a crew from Russia Today, who are going to make this a big stink. And these news media were documenting non-violent protests near Ofer Prison, and the IDF just opened up on them with tear gas. Now, a little bit of good news. Holland has now decided that all products made in the illegal Israeli settlements in Palestine have to be labeled as such. They can no longer say made in Israel. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Now, we have been reporting on the meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency. We reported on how when the Iranian representative referred to Israel's genocide against Palestine, that the U.S. and Israeli and Canadian envoys all stormed out, how dare you, blah, blah, blah. Well, they're running into more of the same kind of thing because apparently Iran and members of the Arab League issued a statement in the session of the IAEA Board of Governors in which they expressed their view that it is the activities of the Zionist regime and their nuclear weapons that are a threat to world peace and security. And so I'm sure we can count on the U.S. and Canadian envoys storming out again, how dare you. And that's really all they can do, because all 16 U.S. government intelligence agencies are convinced Iran does not have nuclear weapons, does not have a nuclear weapon program, that their nuclear activities are fully in compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We know Israel does have nuclear weapons. Germany admitted they have known for years that Israel is arming the cruise missiles on those Dolphin-class submarines with nuclear weapons. Israel will not sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, will not allow inspections. And they're still screaming, Iran, 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 Iran. And remember, it's the same stuff they were screaming about Iraq. And there were no weapons of mass destruction. The mobile biological weapons laboratories turned out to be balloon inflators. That little white blob that Colin Powell said was a decontamination vehicle turned out to be an ordinary fire truck. It was all a lie, and they're using the same lie again, and apparently they think you're all dumb enough to fall for it twice in a row. Now, the United States, the Obama administration, was getting ready to give an award to an Egyptian activist who was basically calling attention to forced virginity tests and on female protesters as a form of harassment. But the Obama administration is now going to postpone the award because apparently this Egyptian activist made some un-American and anti-American, anti-Israeli comments on her Twitter account. So the object lesson here for all of you Americans is it doesn't matter what you do in life or how good you are or how great your achievements are. First and foremost, you must make obeisance to Israel or your good works will never be acknowledged. That's the new pathway to success. First, you bow to Israel, then you do something wonderful, and you'll be rewarded. If you do something wonderful and you will not bow to Israel, they're going to pretend it never happened. Needless to say, that is discrimination. And we need to realize that we have been so brainwashed to not discriminate against others that we fail to see that we ourselves are being discriminated against every single day in this country. And that's the reality. Now, getting on to the gun grabbers and some of the hysteria, Eastwood High School in Ohio was locked down. Somebody apparently found some live ammunition inside the building. They don't know where it came from. They found some live ammo inside a bathroom. Probably somebody planted it as a prank, and the school got on lockdown. But that makes a lot more sense than this next story from Harrison Township, Michigan. Students at L'Anse Creuse High School were evacuated Tuesday morning after they saw somebody walking the halls in military gear. And it turns out the man was a 21-year-old former student of that school and an airman at the nearby Selfridge Air National Guard base. He arrived on campus after his overnight shift to meet with a school counselor and was just wearing his work clothes, and everybody went ballistic. And he had taken his gun out. His holster was empty. And they evacuated the school. Everybody's overreacting. They're not trying to teach our kids to be calm, cool, and in an emergency, they're teaching them to be hysterical. And they're going to get these kids killed. Now, we've been talking about where schools are, they're banning cowboys and Indians, cops and robbers. They're suspending kids who even talk about guns or point a finger. And up in Michigan, apparently the school felt it was necessary to confiscate some cupcakes decorated with toy soldiers. And they were confiscated because of what happened at Sandy Hook Elementary. They said, oh, they're insensitive. Well, these were toy soldiers. Maybe these cupcakes were supposed to be honoring our military. And it's just a hysterical overreaction. That's what they want everybody to have, a hysterical overreaction to the mass shooting, to demonize guns and anybody thinking about using guns. And they still won't look at the issue of the fact that 90% of these shooters were on these prescription meds. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Now, as we get into the issue about the drones, the NDAA, and the very obvious signs of an encroaching tyrannical dictatorship on this nation, to keep you in your slave pens, as you deserve, we're now seeing mission creep or law creep. And all the way back when the Abu Ghraib scandal broke, and the American people had to confront the fact that the United States was using torture on captive prisoners. And they gave us 24 and, oh, what if there was a nuclear bomb? And all these scenarios that don't really happen in real life to sort of justify it. And we all know torture does not get you reliable intelligence. It gets you whatever the person being tortured thinks will make the torturer stop. And they made up a bunch of stuff. Remember all these false alarms about, oh, condition red, a terrorist attack is coming. And it all came down to somebody who was, had been waterboarded a dozen times was screaming, yes, I'm aware of a plot to bomb Disneyland or something. And they declare a code red alert and nothing would happen. And I predicted back then that if we sat still for this, we would see the government start to expand this out. It wasn't just terror suspects. They'd get a little loose with the definitions. Now we know they're saying anybody quoting the Constitution's a terror suspect now. Copyright violators are terror suspects. And now we're seeing the same thing with the targeted assassination program that was started post 9/11 to get the people behind 9/11, to get Al-Qaeda. Although they never seem able to find Adam Gadon, who's all over the place and easy to find. So, let me just finish this here real quick. The government is now talking about expanding this assassination program to cover associates of Al-Qaeda. So, if an actual member of Al-Qaeda, and I don't mean the phonies like Adam Perlman or Joseph Cohen or those people, those who really think they're part of an Al-Qaeda and don't realize they're working for CIA and Mossad. If one of those guys, lawyers, accountants, girlfriends, chiropodist, could be targeted for a drone strike. 6 degrees of separation. They could use Al-Qaeda to kill anybody. The U.S. government is claiming the power to assassinate, indefinitely detain, or torture anybody in Al-Qaeda or associated forces. And associated forces means anybody that they perceive is supporting Al-Qaeda directly or indirectly. And the government is saying they can do this assassination, indefinite detention, or torture without due process or even a legal charge, including U.S. citizens. Including now Americans living on American soil. It's a terror campaign. The U.S. government has resorted to a campaign of terror against the American people to try and keep us from standing up and saying we've had enough of this nonsense. It's the same thing the Nazis were doing to the German people as things started to go bad. They created this illusion that the Gestapo was everywhere, heard everything, read everything. And we know through sheer force of numbers that was impossible. And we're getting the same thing here. The government's reading every email. They're looting your computers. They have TV cameras everywhere. You can't do anything without being seen. They're tracking you with your cell phone. They're tracking you with your supermarket discount card. They're tracking you on Facebook and Twitter. Good luck with that one. And now we're going to have drones overhead. If you're doing something the least suspicious, we'll blow you up. It's a campaign of terror. The biggest terrorists we face is the United States government. Story in the Washington Times, they're now saying the newest generation of drones being devised by Homeland Security to fly over the United States itself will be able to detect if you're carrying a concealed firearm. I'd like to see how that works. And again, it may just be a bluff. They're trying to scare you into silence. They're trying to scare you into consent. Trying to scare you out of your guns, out of your freedoms, out of your children. The reality is, even with all the computer power that they may have, they may be able to scan every email. They can't correlate all that data. Because simply scanning email, that's a linear process. But trying to correlate that information, that's an unlimited expansion. There isn't enough computer power in the world to derive meaningful data from the volume of emails that are happening in America. Surveillance cameras, artificial vision systems really aren't that good. If there isn't a human watching that, it's useless. It's a bluff. It's a bluff to get you to stay silent. It's a bluff to make you afraid to speak out about what's gone wrong with your country. Article out of Refreshing News. America is shamed that only Rand Paul is talking about drone executions. Well, he's the only one within the Congress, within the official government, but a lot of people out here are saying this is a bad idea for two reasons. We have seen how many times these drone strikes get the wrong people. We have seen how many times these drone strikes are killing 20 to 30 to 40 innocent bystanders. And that should be of concern to Americans. You may not even know you're standing next to a suspect. The suspect may not even know he's a suspect. And there's a blinding flash and you're blown to bloody bits, and the government is going to say, well, sorry, but collateral damage, it was worth it to get the bad guy. How do you know he's a bad guy? Well, he's dead, isn't he? He wouldn't be dead if he wasn't a bad guy. And of course, based on the track record of these machines in foreign countries, a lot of them are just falling out of the sky because they're built about as good as the F-22, the F-35, and the Boeing Dreamliner. And so you may be a perfectly innocent person going about your life, doing what you're supposed to do and not complaining, and you could have one of these multi-million-dollar machines crash through your roof without warning. And you ought to be concerned about that. And as I mentioned the other day, now that there has actually been a near miss between a drone and a passenger jet, there's going to be a hue and cry to keep the drones away from the airport terminal control areas. Now, if you know anything about urban planning, what they tend to do around the airports is zone them for light industry, because people don't want to live next to these airports with all the noise. So they put industrial zones around them. And that's where the criminals and potentially terrorists are going to set up their shop, because they know the drones won't be overhead. And so this whole drone idea that we're going to catch the terrorists and the bad guys with the drones, it can't work. They can't send the drones everywhere without risking civilian air traffic, and the bad guys are just going to go where the drones will not. Just like the bad guys will go to the towns where there's gun control. They're going to go where the guns are not to be found and stay away from where the guns are. The same thing will apply to the drones. This can't work. Multi-billion-dollar business already, producing nothing of any real use. Speaking of nothing of any real use, apparently at the Newark airport, February 25th, a TSA operative was able to get onto an airplane with a bomb. Cleared to board the plane. Just made a complete joke of all the groping, the fondling, the swabbing, the naked body scanners. This guy was able to get on board the plane with an actual explosive. Thank goodness he was not working for Israel, trying to blow up a plane and blame it on Iran. But it's a reminder that all this TSA nonsense is, like the drones, like the reading of your email, like the TV cameras, it's a gigantic bluff to keep you scared and cowed and afraid to stand up and say what has gone wrong with this nation. Apparently this agent had an improvised explosive device strapped to his leg inside the pants, and nobody caught it. Epic fail. Epic waste of money. Up in Washington State, they're looking at Senate Bill 5618 that would allow police officers or school resource officers to search students without probable cause and without parental consent. They're talking about random searches of students. No probable cause required, no permission from the parents. I'd take my kid out of a school like that, put him in private school, or I'd homeschool. Now, here's a very sad story, and this is out of CBS in Chicago. Apparently this gentleman, and I use the term loosely, Christopher M. Boer, 39 years old, has been paying a 24-year-old woman for the last 2 years to use the woman's daughter to make child pornography. And they're both facing federal charges in the case. And I'm glad they're charging the woman, because there have been a lot of these cases, and back in the 1990s during the feminist hysteria, they were always screaming about how, oh, men are always buying children for all these evil purposes, and they would never talk about the mothers who were willing to sell. Now, the first article I found, this was, again, at CBS, they avoided naming the woman, but I found another article over at WTSP who named her Natasha Hillard and confirmed she was the mother. And this is really sick stuff. I read stories like this and I start thinking maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea if that asteroid did shift course and slam into this planet. Because this is very disgusting behavior. And as I said, I'm no saint, and I'm not going to hold my life up as a model for anybody. Okay? What any number of adults wish to do in the privacy of their own homes with assorted home appliances and a barnyard animal, that's fine. More power to them. But when it comes to children, I have some very primal instincts that kick in. I can't imagine what this little girl is going to be dealing with as she grows up. And how any woman who is a mother could even consider doing something like this. I'm wondering if this mother was on antidepressants. Or the guy. It's such horrible behavior. It really is. Now then, we're going to go on and bash the Carbonazis a little tiny bit. Over at thecommentator.com, they have a very interesting article about how the green agenda is in meltdown. We had commented earlier that we're seeing this renewed attempt to resell global warming. The temperatures are going up hotter and faster. To pay no attention to all these snowstorms. It really doesn't mean anything at all. Business Insider ran a story saying the Earth is getting hotter faster than it ever has since the dawn of civilization. Global warming, like the Holocaust, has become the new fish story. Every time it's told, the fish is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the Northeast is paralyzed by snow. Spring officially begins in a couple of weeks. And back to this article at thecommentator.com, they're saying it's the mass media's credibility, not the Arctic, that is melting down. And they're absolutely right. Now, over at the Daily Mail, they're reporting on a study by NASA where NASA is kind of throwing up their hands and saying, we don't know what the heck is going on with the sun. Because this year was supposed to be the peak of the 11-year sunspot cycle, the solar maximum. But solar activity, the number of sunspots, is very, very low. And NASA is saying it's unexpected. Well, we've seen this before. It was called the Maunder Minimum, which triggered the Little Ice Age. And it would appear as the solar activity stays low and we get these record winters that we have again reconfirmed the link between the Maunder Minimum and the Little Ice Age. A quiet sun means more cosmic rays will reach the Earth, triggering cloud formation. The more clouds you have, the more sunlight gets reflected back into space and the Earth cools down. Now, the reality is that accurate measurements of the sun have only been possible for the last 100 years. While the 11/22-year solar maximum cycle is well known, longer cyclic activity, especially longer than 100 years, may well exist but not yet have been recognized. In any event, this lack of solar activity in what is supposed to be the peak of the sunspot cycle tells us we may be on the verge of a new Little Ice Age. And if we want to stay warm, it's time to burn Al Gore and the Carbonazis. Release all that CO2 into the atmosphere to try and save our world. These kinds of phenomenon, solar radiation, the changing orbit of the Earth, cycles from circular to elliptical and back, coinciding, not surprisingly, with the ice ages. This is what's controlling climate. that tiny fraction of 1% of atmospheric carbon dioxide produced by human activity is not a valid factor. They just picked on it because they wanted to blame you for a warming planet, even though it's getting cold, in order to guilt you out of taxes and obedience. It's another gigantic government fraud. Anybody who says there's no such thing as gigantic government conspiracies to control the people, there's one right there. ClimateGate. We caught them lying. We caught them rigging the data. We've got the computer code they used to create the hockey stick out of thin air. We've caught them fudging the data over and over again. They were going into Wikipedia and editing the articles on the Roman and medieval warming periods to minimize them and say it wasn't really a factor, that it's much worse now in the warming. It wasn't. Roman and medieval warm periods were much warmer than today. The Cretaceous period was 30 degrees warmer overall than today. The planet didn't die. The dinosaurs were quite happy. Lots of oxygen in the atmosphere from all of the abundant plant life that were sucking in the carbon dioxide and putting out oxygen. Didn't come to an end until the Chicxulub asteroid smacked them all down again. Going to take a break for commercials. Be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Now, longtime listeners and readers know I have been severely critical of this whole global warming nonsense ever since it began. I'm not alone in that, obviously. I get a lot of emails accusing me of being anti-science. And that is, of course, ridiculous. I spent a great deal of my life working in science. I'm opposed to science being used fraudulently as a political tool. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of like my views about religion. I don't care what your personal religion is. I have no intention of talking you out of it. But I oppose the way religion is used and institutionalized as a tool of exploiting the people and enslaving the people. And the same thing is with science. Scientific method is a way of arriving at the truth. And the reason scientific method exists at all is the upfront recognition that an individual scientist is subject to the same human weaknesses as anybody else. They can be bribed. They can be influenced. Their ambition can get the better of them, lead them to some reckless behavior. Their own personal religious delusions can get in the way of their objectivity. And that's why the idea of reproducibility and scientific method came into being, to protect science and its conclusions from the frailties of the scientists themselves. And so I would encourage everybody listening to this show to adopt the scientific method as their guideline in finding out what the truth is going to be about any of this stuff, and never take an individual scientist's word about anything. This whole global warming was sold on the idea that there was a consensus opinion among climatologists. Well, consensus isn't science, and science isn't consensus. We all know Galileo was right, even though the consensus of his day was that he was wrong. The sun is the center of our solar system, and the Earth does orbit around it. Galileo was right, the consensus was wrong. That's why you should ignore the consensus. There's a wonderful line in the stage play and movie The Enemy of the People. And it says, we're always told the majority is right. The majority is always right. But in fact, the majority is always wrong. Because before the majority can be right, one man must be right. And while that one man is right and alone, the majority is wrong. This several hard winters should convince us that the long-term prognostications of the carbon Nazis, the global warming cult, were bogus. They don't know what they're talking about. And they're still out there trying to scream, it's getting worse, it's getting worse. The Earth's temperature is accelerating upward since the beginning of recorded history. I mean, when you get hype like that, it's politics, it's public relations, it's a sales pitch. It's not science. Going to take a break here. We'll be back with the Lady Claire after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And for those of you on Justin TV, this gorgeous creature sitting behind me is the lovely Lady Claire. who likes to join us every third hour, every Friday, with her particular viewpoint on the world. And the first topic you wanted to talk about?
Well, there are a couple of articles that came as kind of shockers in terms of education in this country, which, Americans, and especially American officials, Mayor Bloomberg, are you listening, like to say that they support. It has been found that New York City's literacy rates are on the decline. And by this, I mean not a few people are having trouble reading with basic skills. 80% of New York City's high school graduates lack basic skills like reading, writing, math, and are required to relearn them before qualifying to go to community college. Mike, this shouldn't be.
But I'm sure they absolutely know that the world is getting warmer and we should all pay carbon taxes and bow 3 times daily towards Al Gore.
Yeah, it makes no sense, and it breaks my heart.
Well, it makes a lot of sense when you understand that the public educational system is no longer about education as much as it is about indoctrination.
Yeah, right.
The money junkies don't want a general population able to think critically and analytically or use the scientific method. Mm-hmm. They want people who will know just enough to run the factory machines and pay their taxes and pull the trigger on the designated enemy of the day. They don't want people to be any smarter than that. This actually goes all the way back to Andrew Carnegie, who, when he set up his Carnegie Foundation for Education, had as an agenda revamping America's education system so that the working classes were not taught anything more than they absolutely needed to be good, obedient workers. And if you go back and you look at the state of education in colonial times, where it's amazing how well educated Americans were back then compared to today.
Well, if you take a look at the McGuffey's Eclectic Reader, which was way back late 19th century, the language that was used was very adult language, and the kids understood what the language meant. And the other thing I wanted to mention about education in the U.S. is that in the Chicago public school system, students potentially affected by school closings this year are primarily African American.
Imagine my shock.
And of 129 schools located mostly on the south and west sides, 117 are majority African American, and 119 of them have a percentage of African American students higher than the district average. I mean, this just so bites for these kids.
The closings are being racially biased here. And it's kind of amazing that Barack Obama, who prides himself on being America's first black president, doesn't seem to have any curiosity about this, and certainly has a lot of influence in Chicago, but he's not using it.
Yeah, it really breaks my heart, because education and how a society treats its most fragile of its members, I think, are what history is going to judge that society on.
Well, setting aside the verdict of history, the reality is the modern world is quite technological, and if we are not training our kids to be on a par with, for example, the Asian kids in terms of science, engineering, and math, then we are cutting our own throat economically for the future, because nobody is going to start up high-tech companies in the United States of America if there is an insufficient number of potential employees who can do a really, really good job.
And in one of the most recent educational ratings of the world, I mean, the U.S. is down at 17. And blinked and missed to Finland and South Korea? That shouldn't be.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. We got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And Claire, your next topic was regarding Italy.
Yes. Fitch Credit Rating Agency has just downgraded Italy's credit rating to BBB+, citing mushrooming debt and recession as the main reasons for the downgrade. This is going to get dicey because the election put the Italian government in sort of a state of suspended animation. And Grillo, the comedian turned politician, is not wanting to accept any kind of compromise situation, and I think he was wise not to do that. But he is talking about bringing Italy back to the lira and the use of the lira, and abandoning the euro at this point. And I can certainly
I'm sure that's
understand.
probably the reason that Fitch's did it, as kind of a warning shot that if Italy goes back to the lira, they'll be cut off from all international banking, which at this point might not be a bad thing.
No.
But we do know that the Berlusconis and the other gentlemen who are pro-banker, pro-austerity, they love the private central bank. They're going to refuse to form a coalition government to force a second election. It's the same thing they did down in Greece. And there'll be rampant vote fraud, and Italy, the Italian people, will be delivered back into the clutches of the private central bankers yet again.
I do not know that the Italian people are going to go so gently into that good night of fiscal austerity. I have a feeling that if people try to put them back in that situation, that there is going to be a very loud resonance of the word in Italian "basta," which means enough.
Okay. Well, we know that Greece's government now is literally going into a bunker mode. They've hired Blackwater
Academy now. Its name has changed.
Its name has changed to Academy.
Yes.
They've hired Academy now to bolster their police forces, and to basically, Italy is starting to prepare for violence among their people along the same lines that the U.S. government is preparing for violence here. They're getting guns and ammunition and body armor and tanks and everything good to go, because, again, the attitude of the government is you must make do with less so we can have more. You must make do with less so we can have more. And by golly, if you're not going to go along with that, we're going to come and do really painful things to you and your children.
Absolutely. And speaking of painful things, I'd like to segue back into an issue that you touched on earlier in the show, about the U.S. government wanting to expand the assassination program to cover associates of associates of associates of associates of associates of associates of Al-Qaeda. And I think we have to look at the bigger picture here, Mike. And the question is, what causes people to embrace radicalism and militancy? And
well, it's basically when they have no other choice here. It's not like somebody just gets up in the morning over there in the Middle East and just says, there's nothing on TV, and I have nothing better to do today. I think I'll go blow up a building. Basically, terrorism is unconventional warfare pointed back at us. Have you ever noticed that when it's our guys doing it to the people, the governments we don't like, they're freedom fighters, and when it's their guys doing it back to us, then all of a sudden they're terrorists? There's a very easy way to stop global terrorism, and that is to stop screwing around with other people's countries. But the United States considers it part of its manifest destiny to screw around with other people's countries, and the resulting backlash of acts of terror and war and violence directed at the American people is just another cost of doing business. One that the money junkies, the private central bankers, are historically all too willing to pay.
And when there is vast corruption, cronyism, lack of transparency, and no real say in how a person's country is run, coupled with grinding poverty, lack of education, and health services, the siren call of militancy becomes attractive to individuals who understand that their individual and collective aspirations as human beings, as things stand, will never come to pass. And if the U.S. government really wanted to get rid of militancy, specifically militancy against the United States, it has got to start working in a more smart manner in terms of its foreign policy. And one of the biggest examples of this is the abject failure in Yemen.
Yes.
Yemen is a case in point of an abysmally failing U.S. government foreign policy, and instead of using aid as both a carrot and a stick, the U.S. government has decided that the use of drone strikes with which to repel rebel activity is their only choice. Naturally, the Yemenite people don't like us very much, and I can't really blame them. What the U.S. government should be doing here is to compel the al-Hadi government, and President al-Hadi was the only guy who had his name on the ballot after al-Salah was thrown out of town.
Gee, I wonder if he's going to win the election.
And, but in some way compel that government to distribute desperately needed food and medicines to the Yemenite people, and not give it to his cronies to sell on the black market. The U.S. government should be working with the government of Yemen to create public-private partnerships to build roads, bridges, and hospitals, and providing the Yemenite people with employment, because the unemployment rate in that country is through the roof. The U.S. government should also be encouraging the government of Yemen to develop opportunities for foreign investment and develop a skilled labor force. Of course, all of these steps would be logical.
Well, more than that, all of those steps would be a threat
Yeah.
to the dollarification of
Yeah.
the resources in the area, and that is the United States' overarching agenda here. In all of these lands that they're conquering, it's either take them over directly or force a regime change so that the new regime, the new government, will commit to selling the resources only for the U.S. dollar so that the U.S. can basically loot the world for manufactured goods and agriculture in exchange for these printed paper tickets that other nations will need to have in order to meet their resource needs from these other countries. And that is really what is driving the U.S. war agenda right now.
It's almost as though what the U.S. government is doing is engineered and guaranteed to create more instability rather than less.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's the goal is to go into these countries, destabilize them, and then scream intervention. We must support the opposition, whatever it takes. But the ultimate goal is for the whoever survives the conflict will commit to selling that nation's resources only for U.S. dollars. In order to basically bring back and expand the petrodollar deal. And now they're getting ready to do it to Argentina. And as far as this whole thing about rise of militancy goes all the way back to John F. Kennedy, who said, when peaceful revolution is made impossible, violent revolution becomes inevitable.
And that has been so true, throughout this recent history of U.S. military misadventures overseas. You talk about Iraq. What an absolute colossal failure that has been.
Well, it's not a failure because Iraq's oil is now for sale on the world market only for U.S. dollars. And as long as Iraq's new government continues to do that, the U.S. doesn't care what else is going on inside Iraq.
Yeah, but the people of Iraq, the level of suffering has
just... Oh, the people. They have nothing to do with this. It's all about the oil and the petrodollar, and who cares about the people? You ask any money junkie on Wall Street, what about the people? If they don't have money to buy something, who cares about them?
Yeah, I seem to remember that before the invasion and occupation of Iraq, it had one of the highest standards of living in the Middle East.
It absolutely did. And they had no gun control. If you lived in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, you could buy and own a fully automatic machine gun. Does that sound like a tyrannical dictator to you? It doesn't to me.
And remember,
obviously, he was not afraid of his own people.
Remember that incident when he was not surrounded by bodyguards and just out there in front of his people? And, in the U.S., there would have been 90 Secret Service guys, in all
plus
sorts
a cloud of
yeah.
Lexan. Remember when you and I were going to get our marriage license and Clinton was showing up with a bunch of the top California Democrats, and the podium was just surrounded by all these frame-mounted sheets of Lexan. You could really barely see into there at all. Secret Service all over the place.
Snipers
on the roof.
God.
And it was just... and
it was a little unsettling to walk into, I've got to tell you.
It was, and we were not there for the political rally, and we still got the going over from all this stuff. And they're really out there, and it's the hallmark of a government that is in fact afraid of its people, even all the way back then. It's worse now with all these armored limousines with built-in oxygen systems and all this other stuff. This last Christmas when Obama came out here for his extended vacation, the Secret Service was actually checking us out. And they sent this guy over to this food distribution for the Hungry program that we're involved in. And he was trying to pretend like he was a new member of the congregation and just trying to sort of fish around for whether we were a threat to Obama, which we're not because he's just a front man here. Yeah. And, of course, it all worked out in the end because we made him carry all the heavy stuff.
That was a very weird vibe. and to maybe end this segment, I noticed an article that cities continue to get tanks they don't need in nationwide police militarization trend. And they get it through DOD programs where a little city, let's say back in the South, had a total of 3 murders in 1999.
Yes.
They got a tank.
And the Department of Homeland Security has bought 2,700 of these. They're considered mine-resistant, explosive-resistant vehicles. And all of these police departments that are getting them are trying to come up with a reason why this is a necessary piece of police equipment. They're talking about, to protect our soldiers in hazardous warrant delivery. Well, to deliver the warrant, you have to get out of the tank.
Yeah.
So that excuse absolutely does not make any sense. This is about militarizing the police to crush you down if you dare stand up and question your masters. Got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And Claire, your next topic is?
Well, I looked at an article that indicated that attacks and anti-Arab bigotry have become, quote-unquote, more acceptable in Israel, and that's really unfortunate. And apparently we've had a spate of epithet-laced attacks by young Israeli Jews against Arabs indicates anti-Muslim and anti-Arab bigotry is becoming more acceptable in many sectors of Israeli society today, according to rights workers. And,
well, it's always been there, but it was sort of, kept out of sight of the tourists and the world press. But apparently now they don't care any longer. We were talking earlier about how the IDF tear-gassed journalists who were covering a peaceful protest in the West Bank, talking about all these illegal settlers who are destroying the olive orchards of the Palestinians. And it takes 10 years for a newly planted olive tree to bear a sellable crop. And so this is major economic damage. And apparently this last grove that was destroyed, the IDF were right there protecting the settlers from the Palestinian farmers whose land that they were on. So it's just the discrimination and the apartheid is wide out in the open for everybody to see. But Israel is mounting this massive campaign to basically hijack the universities in Canada and the United States of America, so they stop holding these apartheid weeks and they stop supporting the boycott and divest movement. Israel's attitude is, it's okay for us to do this, it's just not okay for you to talk about it.
Yes, and attempting to shoot the messenger, as they did with the press people who were covering peaceful Palestinian protests. It's not working in the 21st century, and someone in the IDF and the Israeli government had better wake up and take notice, because all it is doing is demonstrating more clearly the xenophobic, ugly bigotry and hatred Israelis have against Palestinians.
Well, I think Israel's leadership suffers from the same problem as America's leadership. The people who are in charge are really a bunch of Cold War fossils who learned their craft during the 1950s and 1960s when propaganda worked and was effective. We see Israel again today trying to wave around the Holocaust to quiet their critics, because that's what worked back in the 1950s and the 1960s. But it doesn't work any longer.
Nope.
They've overplayed their hand, but Israel still keeps on doing what worked before, and they just can't deal with the fact that it isn't working any longer. In fact, more than a few articles have appeared recently in response to this attempt to reinvigorate the Holocaust by claiming that instead of 6 million victims, it was 20 million victims. And they're basically saying Israel just doesn't get it, that the propaganda that used to work and control the minds of the people. Let me say that again. The propaganda that used to work and control the minds of the people isn't working any longer. And Israel just doesn't know how to deal with it, so they just go back to repeating what worked before, and they hope they'll get a different outcome.
And, Mike, the reality is all genocide is morally disgusting and wrong. It's just wrong,
Genocide is just murder on a racially biased scale. Murder is wrong.
Yeah.
It is wrong to kill your fellow human being unless they are trying to kill you. Israel is an apartheid state. Even the former South African government, and they are the world's experts on apartheid, are saying, yes, Israel's an apartheid state. The United States opposed South African apartheid, but because our government is totally controlled by Israel right now, you will not hear a peep out of our government that what Israel is doing is wrong. In fact, again, going back to the IAEA summit meeting, when Iran pointed out Israel's actions. The Canadian and U.S. envoys stormed out with that, how dare you impugn and malign Almighty Israel.
How dare you tell the truth?
Yes, and that's really what it comes down to. Yeah. And they're doing these kind of grandstanding things because there is no reply to what Israel is doing. And I think back to that interview that Amy Goodman did with a former member of the Knesset who just came out and said, screaming anti-Semitism, that's just a trick. It's a trick to shut people up who are asking questions Israel does not really have an answer for.
And it's very ironic to me that people who are, many of them are the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors who understand the evil that can be propagated by religious or ethnic bigotry, don't get it.
Well, what the problem is that Israelis feel because of this supposed horrible thing that was done to their ancestors in the first half of the last century justifies them doing to others. You know, all under this idea that unless we're totally in control and have all of our opponents and enemies crushed down, we will never feel safe. The reality is, for a people claiming to have been oppressed throughout the last 2,000 years, they are proving themselves to be the worst oppressors of all.
It's really unfortunate, and perhaps the most accurate snapshot of 21st century Israel would be as follows. A wretchedly apartheid, self-proclaimed theocracy with nuclear weapons. That's scary.
That's the scary part.
That's the scary part.
What's that line from Monty Python and the Holy Grail? Fetch hither the holy hand grenade.
Yes.
Israel names all their weapon systems after these biblical characters, and you know, and they refer to nuclear war as the Samson option.
Yikes.
Religious fanatics with nuclear weapons. We don't have to go to the Arab nations for that.
Oh,
go
no.
to Israel.
Oh,
Got to
no.
take a break for commercials. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And Claire, your next topic is...
There was an article I saw this morning that said, lack of an Israeli government won't stop Obama trip. And as the people who listen to the show and watch the show understand, the coalition work between the parties in the Israeli government has been going a lot more slowly than I'm sure Prime Minister Netanyahu would have liked. It's
even
looking,
with that crisis that he provoked with that Palestinian dissident tortured to death. He was hoping that was going to flare up and he could just scare everybody into forming a coalition government to deal with the crisis and the emergency.
It didn't work. And apparently this particular trip will have any peace negotiations with Palestinians written off the script. It's not going to happen.
It's off there. Obama is going to visit the Temple Mount, get his picture taken in his yarmulke by the Wailing Wall, and of course, it doesn't matter whether there's a coalition government, because what Obama is actually doing is he's going to meet with Netanyahu and try and figure out how they're going to start the war with Iran in some way that the American people will say, oh yes, this was just and necessary, and here, have my small child to throw onto the Iranians' bayonets.
Right, and when Obama returns from Israel, if we see a massive ramp-up of demonization of Iran in the corporate media, that may well signal that Netanyahu has gotten Obama to sign off on some kind of a preemptive military strike against Iran.
Well, I think that deal's already been made. We're certainly seeing the demonization ramp up. We've got sources inside the White House saying the war is on for this summer. You've got Lindsey Graham and Robert Menendez are in the Senate passing this bill, which will just automatically commit the United States to support Israel in a war against Iran, even if Israel starts it.
And without declaring war.
And again, this is another way of getting around the constitutional requirement that only Congress can declare a war.
Yeah. And for those in the bowels of power in D.C. and Tel Aviv...
I love that phrase.
...who really believe that such a strike would be a good thing, I really think I have a moral responsibility to strongly caution them on the following. This strike against Iran may not go all that well because, as you and I have discussed, Mike, the U.S. government doesn't have the troop strength, it doesn't have the manufacturing, and it sure as heck doesn't have the money, $16 trillion plus in debt, to ensure a successful outcome.
Oh, the U.S. government debt is far worse than that. With all the unfunded mandates and bailouts and everything, it's somewhere around $220 trillion. The reality is we're seeing it. The U.S. modern weapons really aren't all that good. I know we were all told during Operation Desert Stomp that the Patriot missile was intercepting better than 90% of the inbounds. Turned out that was another government lie. It was only getting about half of them.
Yeah.
And when you're dealing with an inbound missile with a biological weapon, it doesn't really matter where it comes down, even if it's successfully intercepted.
Yeah.
The germs are going to come on down within your territory. We know the problems that are plaguing the F-22. The F-35, they're now entirely grounded because of problems with the engines. It still does not have the helmet-linked fire control system delivered. The drones are falling out of the sky, all kinds of problems. These wonder weapons are hideously expensive, and they're very badly designed. We were talking the other day about how the USS Yorktown, they tried to modernize it and computerize it with networked Windows machines running Windows NT, and a single divide by zero error shut the entire ship down.
Ouch.
And of course,
that's bad.
The attack on Iran is going to bring us into direct conflict with Russia. And Russia's military development, up until recently, I really have not had a chance to look at their latest weapon systems all that well. But historically, their idea is simple and reliable and cheap. And that has been something that has worked very well for them. And so, again, we're looking at this thing escalating completely out of control up to and including a nuclear world war.
Yep.
And the money junkies in Wall Street are saying, yeah, good idea, let's do it, come on, we got millions of kids out of work, we'll just put them in the Army. In fact, somebody wrote in and said, this is what all these communities can use with these tanks they're getting for the police forces, is they can start training all their out-of-work kids for jobs with the U.S. Army.
And another interesting development late last month, and you and I have talked about it, but I think it's important to emphasize in context of this potential attack by the U.S. against Iran. Charlie Rangel, dear Charlie Rangel, very interesting congressional representative, has introduced legislation to reinstate the draft. And this time they are not only coming for America's sons, they're also coming for America's daughters as well.
And that, I think, betrays a great deal of desperation, because when you are placing your females at risk in combat, you're not just risking their lives, you're risking the potential to rebuild your population in the post-war environment.
Right.
And, because what a guy contributes to a pregnancy is about, 7-8 minutes? The woman, 9 months. And historically, when a country places their women into combat roles, it is an indication they are in desperate straits. They don't have the manpower. Even with all these, they're about ready to instantly legalize 11 million immigrants and probably send them right over to the military recruiter.
Right.
Even with all of that, if they're putting women into combat roles, it is a sign that the U.S. is militarily exhausted, and they're placing our future population growth at risk, putting these women into combat roles.
And especially with the problems of weapons that they've been using that have depleted uranium, as people in Iraq
It's already a crisis.
Yeah.
Our returning veterans, they've served their time, they come home, they think they got away, without injury, and they don't even realize how badly damaged they are. They come home, they get married, they have children, and there's an epidemic of severe birth defects in the children of our returning veterans because of exposure to the depleted uranium. And it's another one of these big, deep, dark secrets the U.S. government doesn't want you thinking about, especially if you're a young person considering a career in the military. Just the fact that you get home does not mean you're out of danger in dealing with the depleted uranium. Plus, a lot of these kids are coming home hopelessly addicted on these prescription antidepressants that the Army doctors are handing out like candy.
Right.
The U.S. government spends more on these SSRIs for our troops than they spend on Black Hawk helicopters.
That's scary.
The few, the proud, the drugged out of their mind.
Yeah.
And these kids, and this is why we have this epidemic of suicides. We're losing more of our kids to suicide than to enemy action. No other war in history has seen that problem. And it all goes back to these prescription antidepressants. And the kids come home, they're hooked on these things. The local doctor says, sure, I'll give you a prescription. The pharmacist says, sure, I'll sell them to you. And a lot of them are being recruited by the police forces. And so it's entirely possible that our police forces have a higher than the 10% average of population that are using these medications. Maybe that's where this cannibal cop came from. Ooh. His brain is just completely addled on these chemicals.
Yeah, that was a really terrible story.
Anything else?
Yes, actually. The BRIC countries. This is an acronym for countries that have joined together, kind of non-aligned, but looking to nourish their financial situation. Diplomats and leaders from the BRIC countries are also thrashing out details on the proposed currency swap mechanism, a potentially game-changing idea that could take on the dollar, the euro, and other currencies.
Yeah, and that's why these BRIC nations are going to be added to the list to countries to be conquered and put in their place.
To-do list.
Because they're basically talking about conducting trade amongst themselves without going through the dollar.
Yes, and in fact, one of the representatives, Mrs. Nakoana Mashabain, said she envisioned a conclusion of the discussion on the currency swap to happen in Durban, and the idea behind the currency swap was meant to keep trade within the BRIC countries, within the confines of the League's currencies, so that, quote unquote, you don't have to go through other countries that are not involved in the transaction, which makes sense. And the intra-BRICS trade is now more than $300 billion and is expected to reach $500 billion by 2015. That's not that very far away.
Well, they just got put on the list of countries to be invaded and conquered.
Yes, on the to-do list.
And again, that is the U.S. government's agenda in all of these wars, to keep the dollar as the global trade and reserve currency, by hook or by crook or by invasion, certainly by conquering or controlling all the resource-rich areas and telling them you will only sell your resources for the dollar. So that the rest of the world has to bring real wealth to America to get the little paper tickets to run off and get the resources they need. They did this with the petrodollar. The petrodollar has been in decline because of Israel's arrogance and belligerence. So now the U.S. is going to force the petrodollar back on the new form of revived Bretton Woods. They're going to force Bretton Woods and the petrodollar deal back onto the world by force of arms. That's the agenda. It's war for the bankers. Again.
Absolutely. And one last thing.
Yes.
Okay. Apparently, Malaysia has been invaded by hundreds of terrorists who are landing on beaches, and we're not hearing all that much in the Western media. And apparently they have crossed over from Philippines and landed in the eastern Malaysian state of Sabah. Dozens are dead, and the Malaysian military has brought in aircraft and armor to confront this invasion. And a seemingly headline news event, the invasion has been really played down by much of the Western media, many calling militant al-Qaeda terrorists an armed Filipino clan. No.
Well, we did report this briefly earlier in the week, and of course the first question comes to mind is, what kind of resources does Malaysia have?
Many.
Many. A lot of oil. That's why Japan was after them in the run-up to World War II. So I would presume, since the American media is not covering this a lot, that these are our al-Qaeda terrorists.
Yes, and not the bad al-Qaeda terrorists.
You know, these are the good al-Qaeda terrorists because they're working for the United States of America to overthrow yet another unoffending nation and take control of its resources for the greater glory of the Federal Reserve Note.
Now, it's the banking system in Malaysia, because it's a Muslim country, is an Islamic banking system. And I'm wondering if part of this is not because there are no Rothschild-controlled banks in Malaysia.
Absolutely. Absolutely, that's what's going on. We're going to conquer those people, and we're going to bring them the benefits of the American way of life, rigged elections, torture, drone strikes from the sky, and a private central bank issuing all of the public currency as a loan at interest.
Right. It just, it doesn't really make sense unless you put it into the context of the economic and resources context.
Again, all wars are banker wars. Forget all the other excuses about, evil tyrant, crushing his population, bringing in democracy. It's all propaganda. The ultimate motive is to force this private central banking scheme on the entire world, to make the world one giant reserve bank which will condemn all of humanity to permanent slavery forever. Because when you have a private central bank, issuing the global currency as a loan at interest, the debt will always exceed the money supply. There is no way out of it other than guillotine for the bankers.
Or, throwing them in jail, which Iceland did, a little kinder, a little gentler. And,
let's take away their wealth. I mean, when you take away their wealth, they'll throw themselves out of a window anyway. That's how you punish the money junkies. You take away their money, they go into withdrawal, they sweat, they cry, they roll around on the ground. And, that's how you punish a money junkie. You take away their wealth, you put them out on the streets homeless. Mm-hmm. You mark their credit record, do not loan this person a single nickel.
Right.
And you take away their ability to create money with the stroke of a pen, because that is their entire power over the rest of us. Mm-hmm. They are legalized counterfeiting operations.
Right.
Everything the Federal Reserve does was a death penalty offense under the Coinage Act of 1792. Mm-hmm. It's a legalized counterfeiting operation. If you were to do what the Federal Reserve does, you would go to jail. When the Federal Reserve does what the Federal Reserve does, they get bonuses.
Yes, and they get to go home and sleep in their own beds,
that's exactly
as Elizabeth
right.
Warren said.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I think that's it, and
All
thank
right.
you.
We're going to turn down your microphone, let you get out of here. We've got a couple more stories to finish up before we get to Pauhana Friday and go out and, again, feed the hungry on this island. And again, the crowds are getting bigger and they're getting younger. So all this talk about the soaring Dow and the new jobs report and everything, it's just more USDA choice bovine excrement. If you want to know the real state of the economy, just walk around your own community, use your own eyes. That big corporate TV news channel is paid to lie and deceive you, to sell you things, to sell you the new car, even though your current car is still working fine, to sell you the new policy, to sell you the latest fashions, to sell you the next president, to sell you on the illusion that everything is all hunky-dory and there is no reason for you to be upset with the existing social order. Use your own eyes, use scientific method, use your own brain, and decide for yourself, is this nation really working for the people? Is it on the right track? Or have we become the Fourth Reich? Now, getting back to science and health issues that we were touching on earlier, we are seeing an emerging problem from all of the antibiotics. When they first appeared, they were wonderful. Killed germs, and they put antibiotics and everything. In fact, now down at our bank, when you're standing in line ready to go to a teller, there's a little dispenser for an antibiotic desanitizing cream thing. And because the bacteria are life forms that evolve, they, like the weeds in our food gardens that have evolved resistance to the Roundup weed killer, the bacteria have become resistant to antibiotics. And we're now beginning to see strains of very deadly microbes that are resistant to the most powerful antibiotics they have. And hospitals and nursing homes are being warned that these microbes, if they get in, they're going to start killing people, and there's nothing that can be done about it. Because of evolution. This is evolution on display for everybody. Or as Nietzsche said, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. Now, a team of scientists from Yale University in the United States and the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg in Germany is saying that processed food, junk food, is partly to blame for the sharp increase in autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis, including alopecia, asthma, and eczema. But it makes a lot of money for the food corporations, and therefore we're going to just let it go on. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show as we're winding up our little Friday truthgasm. There's a video linked to the front page of whatreallyhappened.com. And the headline reads, Leaked Pentagon Video, Flu Vaccine Used to Modify Human Behavior. And after you get past the introduction, which is sort of a blending of V for Vendetta and Max Headroom, it goes to this actual video of a presentation in the Pentagon of a plan to make a flu vaccine that would actually alter the brain to reduce religious fanaticism. And in this presentation, they make it very clear they're talking about Muslims. That if Muslims can be scared into taking this flu vaccine, that they will wake up the next morning all of a sudden just not really caring that much about Allah. And that in theory, this will end the terrorist threat. This, of course, is complete nonsense. The terrorist threat is based on the fact that the U.S. is screwing around with their country. And it was an interesting video to see because apparently today, or actually yesterday, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have issued a warning about a deadly virus previously unseen in humans that has a better than 50% lethality rate. It's a real slate wiper. And, ta-da, most of the infections have occurred in the Middle East. I'm sure it's just a coincidence here. And I have to be very honest. I think we should all be very upset that the U.S. government is funding research to hide chemicals in flu vaccines to change how our brains work. It's right out of Brave New World, altering our brains first permanently, so we'll be less religious. Next, it'll be less defiant, and less suspicious, less skeptical, more obedient. I do not give my consent for that sort of thing. Now then. Let's see. We talked about that already. Let's go back up here. Swedish BitTorrent user accused of sharing Beyoncé album hit with a $233,000 lawsuit from Sony. They're trying to really come down hard on the piracy. And again, piracy is wrong. I understand how when teenagers are seeing their government steal other people's countries, it's hard to convince them copying a digital file is that big of a deal. But at the same time, we're finding out so many of these icons in the anti-piracy movement are themselves committing piracy and ripping things off. I think this whole intellectual property law has gone way overboard and certainly abused the limits of fair use. That's it for our show. We'll be back here on Monday. Don't forget to set your clock Saturday night for daylight savings time. And we'll be back here on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Until then, stay safe, stay well, drive carefully, share what you know with who you know. When you have the courage to speak out, you give others the courage to speak out. Ignore that bluff of drones and email reading and everything. It's just to scare you into silence. Do not be silent. Support Republic Broadcasting and Aloha America.